Willodeen by Katherine Applegate.
Yeah, Katherine Applegate. Willodeen. This book belongs to Apollo. And now...
Well, she told you got it.
Oh, it belongs to your sister. Mm-hmm. That's okay. We'll read it on Apollo Reads. We'll give credit. For Mother Earth, thanks for putting up with us. That is the initial message. There's another message. I have learned you are never too small to make a difference. Greta Thunberg. Do you know who Greta Thunberg is, Apollo?
No.
She's a young girl who became an environmental activist.
What is an activist mean?
Somebody who fights to preserve the environment. Or fights for a cause, really. In her case, it's to preserve the environment. So, let's start part 1, shall we?
Yeah.
The little creatures appears late one afternoon on an old carousel in the village of Perchance. She is propped, dazed, and damped as a newborn on the saddle of a wooden unicorn. She blinks, then blinks some more. She makes a noise, a sort of squeaky growl. Her breath comes and goes in tiny gasps and sighs. Her furry paws move when she tells them to. Her head turns this way and that. She seems to be in fine condition. But where is she? And more importantly, why is she? I'm guessing that's the furry creature there. Mm-hmm. Where is she and why is she?
Is she a half people and a half lizard?
I don't know.
It looks like...
Looks kind of like a beaver lizard. Well,
looks like a lizard, but the tail and body and furry body can look like... Wait.
Well, I don't know. Let's read on. Let's read on and figure out where she is and, importantly, why she is. And maybe what she is. Yeah. She pats the neck of her lifeless steed. Perhaps she should wait here. Yes, that might be the best thing to do, under the circumstances. She does not know herself well yet, but she seems to be a patient sort, and patience, she suspects, might serve her well, might even save her life. The creature has a maker, a boy with nimble fingers and a tender heart. He spent hours weaving weeds and thistledown in the milky moonlight, spinning her into existence. She was... That means that you have a consciousness and you know you're here. And you think, therefore you are. That's existence. She has a friend as well, a girl with sharp eyes and a stubborn soul. And though the girl is young, she understands things that others do not. The creature on the wooden horse knows none of this. Not yet. She does know, all at once and with great certainty, that she is quite alive and quite alone. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, when stones were soft and stars were bits of dust, I loved a monster. It seems forever ago, and perhaps it was, though things weren't really so different. True magic was gentle then, and plentiful, but it's always there, if you know where to look. The moon, after all, still smiles from time to time, and the world still spins like a dancer through the skies. In any case, the whens and wheres don't much matter. The earth is old, and we are not, and that is all you must remember. Chapter 2. I suppose I always loved strange beasts. Even as a wee child, I was drawn to them. The scarier, the smellier, the uglier, the better. Of course, I was kindly disposed toward all of Earth's creatures, birds and bats, toads and cats, slimy and scaly, noble and humble. But I especially loved the unlovable ones, the ones folks called pests, vermin, monsters. Even my favorites were called screechers. They screamed at night like demented roosters for no reason anyone could ever make out. They were grumpy as tired toddlers. They were sloppy as hungry hogs. And I guess there's no nice way to put it. They stank to high heaven. Get one riled, and he'd slap his big tail and give off a stench as ferocious as an outhouse in August. And screechers were almost always riled. That'll happen when people are constantly aiming arrows your way. Screechers had a needle-sharp teeth and dreadful claws. They had wild green and yellow eyes, 2 curlicue tusks, and more drool than a dog at dinner. They weren't big, about the size of a baby bear, I guess you'd say. Their bristly fur was plum-colored, and their tails looked like burnt flapjacks covered in quills. I was the first to admit that screechers weren't exactly charming, but I had a soft spot in my heart for them nevertheless. I'm not sure why. Maybe I knew a thing or two about being unlovable myself. Maybe when the whole world was marching one way, some ornery part of me started shouting, "Go the other way, Willodeen!" You've just got to root for the underdog, don't you? And it sure seemed to me that screechers had always been the underdogs in nature's plan. Although rooting for cute puppies would have been a whole lot easier. Anyway, that's how it was. It'd take someone a whole lot smarter than me to tell you why we love what we love. Chapter 3. I saw my first screechers when I was 6. I was out hunting for sunberries with my pa. I should have been at school, I suppose, but my ma and pa had long since figured out that I was happier on my own. I'd tried attending a few times, but I felt awkward and uncertain around other children, and they seemed to feel the same way about me. We didn't find a single berry. It hadn't rained in forever and a day, and the bushes were shrunk and crumbly. We were about to give up when Pa whispered, "Willodeen!" I followed his gaze. There she was, a ma screecher curled near a fallen tree, along with a tangle of 5 squirming, complaining babies. Right off she noticed us. She whacked her tail on the dirt, hard as could be. Well, I knew what was coming next. Pa had warned me. The smell is hard to describe. Put 100 rotten eggs in your mind, then add some scoops of dead fish and a splash of skunk spray. You'll have the general sense of things. Ain't her fault, Pa said, coughing and sniffling. They rattle easy, poor creatures, and folks is always bothering them. But why? I asked, as I wiped stinging tears from my eyes. Claim they eat livestock, kill pets, wild game. Not a whit of truth to it. I seen 'em eat dillybugs and the like. Mostly they live on peacock snail grubs, worms. Pa rubbed his eyes. Course, there's the matter of their odor. Some say they scare off tourists. He laughed. Ha! That much might be true, at least. We stepped back from the nest, nice and easy, choking on the reek. Pa smiled in spite of it all. She's just doing what she's meant to do, my girl, he told me. Caring for her own, best as she can, like all us ma's and pa's. You'd have thought we'd leave then, stinking as we did, but Pa pointed to a big rock nearby, and there we sat. Seemed we were far enough away for the ma screecher to calm herself. Pa loved creatures, same as me, which is why we had so many roaming the nooks and crannies of our cottage and yard. Goats and tree hares, chickens and dibby ducks, a pea-hen, and an ancient river otter who could no longer swim. Our endless flow of cats and dogs had long since learned not to eat the other residents. See how gentle she is, Pa said as the screecher nestled with her brood. I hear them at night sometimes, I said. I wonder why they make that caterwaul noise, all screechy and harsh. Nobody knows for sure, said Pa. Maybe they're like coyotes and wolves, just singing to the stars. Maybe, I considered the possibility. Too bad they can't carry a tune better. Pa smiled. Nature, Willodeen, knows more than we do, and she probably always will. The ma screecher nudged one of the babies with her snout. I wish people didn't hate them so, I said. They were here first. When you think about it, it doesn't make sense. Pa made a sad, sighing sound, one he hardly ever made, and it startled me. If you're looking for folks to make sense, my girl, he said, you may find yourself looking for a very long time indeed. Chapter 4. After washing our clothes with boiling water and lye soap, my ma finally admitted defeat and burned them in the hearth. Cursed screechers, she muttered at breakfast. What in blazes do you two see in them? Can't eat 'em. Taste like they smell. Useless a critter as I ever met. I glanced across the table at Pa and shared a smile. Nature knows more than we do, Ma. Pa winked, and she probably always will. My brother Toby, who was 2.5, chose that moment to plop a bowl of porridge on his head. Hat, he announced. Ma gazed skyward and groaned. Give me strength. She said that a lot. And then she laughed. Ha ha. She did that a lot, too. She had a fine, wild laugh, my ma. I never went berry hunting with Pa again. A few weeks later, he was dead in the great September fire, along with my ma and my little brother. Like so many others in the village, most of our animals died too. I survived, but just barely, and 2 neighbor women named Bertie and May took me in. By the time I was 10, that particular fire had been forgotten by most, replaced by other dark days, mudslides, fevers, droughts, more fires. It almost seemed the earth was mad at the lot of us. Nature knows more than we do, Pa had said, but some days that was hard to believe. Oh no, she lost her family in a fire, Apollo. Chapter 5.
Like we almost did.
No, not us.
Because there was a fire
In paradise, yeah.
close to us.
There was, yeah. But we weren't in it. Just friends and family we knew. So, nothing to worry about. But in the story, it actually happened. So, Chapter 5. I spent a long time in bed after the fire. I had some burns on my hands and the soles of my feet, but the real problem was all the smoke I'd had in my lungs, making deep breaths hard to come by. While I recovered, May and Bertie gave me reading lessons and a book about dragons. My learning came quick, even if my healing did not. We had a 1-room school in the village, but it wasn't much to look at, and only a few children attended regularly. Most of us worked if we were big enough, or stayed out of the way if we were not. When I was better and May and Bertie pronounced me ready to wander free, that's just what I did. Mostly I wanted to be alone. I felt safe in the hills. I was messy and clumsy. My elbows could always find the most breakable thing in a room. But walking in the woods, my body relaxed, and I moved easily, like an animal that belonged there. I liked keeping to myself. For as long as I could remember, people had always confounded me. I'd given it careful thought and decided that most folks had a sort of clock in their heads. It told them when it was time to laugh at a joke, when to step closer for a whisper of confidence, when to start a conversation, and when to say farewell. My head seemed to be missing that invisible clock. I was always just a bit late, or a bit early, never right on time. I was odd and wary, and that was just the way of things. Like my gray eyes and my untamed hair, red and tangled as a wild rose vine. I wasn't entirely alone, though. I had Duzu, my pet humming-bear. He'd survived the same fire I had, though his wings were so singed he would never fly properly again. May and Bertie had found Duzu in the charred remains of a blue willow tree. They'd brought him to their cottage and nursed him back to health. Same as me. I think they figured he'd bring me a bit of comfort during those bleak, endless days of recovery. If you wanted to make an animal that's the opposite of a screecher, you might come close with a humming-bear. They're everything screechers are not. Duzu was small enough to fit in the pocket of my coat, with room to spare for a biscuit, which he would no doubt eat. His ears were round as coins. His fur reminded me of dandelion fuzz, ready for wishing. A pair of shiny wings sprouted from his back, and he had big eyes, always full of questions. His black, glossy tail curled on itself like a fiddlehead fern in early spring. His mouth, which seemed to rest in a permanent half-smile, hid a long, sticky tongue that slurped up insects in an eye blink. Mostly, Duzu stayed in my pocket or perched on my shoulder. He could fly for a moment or two, but more often he trailed behind me in a sort of hopping run. At night, his delicate snores reminded me of a baby cricket, just learning to croon to the night. Duzu seemed content, although I worried about him being without others of his own kind. One autumn, I even tried to introduce him to some other humming-bears. I set him down near a blue willow full of humming-bear nests, and I walked away, hard as it was to do. Sadly, they wanted no part of him. They could fly, and he could not. And because humming-bears migrate over long distances each year, Duzu could never join them. He was like me that way, different, solitary, forever changed by the fire. In any case, he seemed to have settled on my company. I hoped I was enough. Chapter 6. The annual arrival of humming-bears was our village's claim to fame. They migrated down from the north in huge flocks, confusing the skies and crowding the clouds before landing on the blue willows in our valley. There they stayed until spring, when they flew back to their other home, an island hundreds of miles to the north. It was breathtaking seeing those animals clustered on the trees, their shimmering wings all fluttery. Why they'd chosen perchance, no one was sure. It seemed to have something to do with the gentle winter climate and our stands of blue willows, the only trees where they'd nest. Perchance was tucked in a valley surrounded by wooded hills like a baby in a green cradle. The river Essex ran through town, honey slow. Our blue willows loved the river. They craved water, clutching the banks with their knotty-fingered roots, and the humming-bears loved the willows. It wasn't just their sweet faces and lovely cooing that made the humming-bears so irresistible. It was also their nests, made of glistening bubbles that absorbed sunlight and glowed all night, as if hundreds of miniature rainbows had gathered for a party. No one quite knew how the humming-bears worked their nesting wizardry. They chewed willow leaves, somehow extracting the sap, then blew tough-walled bubbles. The bubbles adhered to each other, and to the branches of the willows, with surprising strength. Most years the village held an autumn fair to celebrate the arrival of the humming-bears, and visitors came from near and far. When I was 7, we'd had to call it off after a mudslide north of the village center. And when I was 9, smoke from a fire 2 ridges over had kept most visitors away. But even without those problems, we'd all noticed that fewer humming-bears were migrating to the village each autumn. Each autumn, the willows still turned silvery blue, the air still got a crisp apple feel to it, and we still prepared for the onslaught of visitors. But something had changed. It was worrisome, to say the least. Perchance depended on money from the tourists. Inns brimmed to overflowing with customers who bought food and ale and trinkets. A boy named Connor Burke made humming bears out of willow and bark and sold them as souvenirs. May sold her thick knitted shawls. Nedwit, Poole, and Baker created humming bear-shaped pastries filled with berry jam. The rest of the year we made ends meet. We tended our garden plots. Some of us worked at the lumber mill. We fished in the river and hunted in the forests. A handful of men had jobs building tracks for the steam railway that skirted the village. But the humming bears and the autumn fair, that's what had always kept us afloat through the lean months. Mostly I avoided the fair, with its teeming crowds that made me feel like I was being smothered. So much noise, so much forced merrymaking. Often I would see children there, ones I recognized from my rare visits to school. They moved in packs like wild dogs. After they passed, I could hear them howling with laughter. I wondered sometimes what it would be like to have a friend, to be so comfortable with myself that I could be comfortable with someone else, too. But I was happy enough. I didn't need the complications and confusions that might come with friendship. Usually, I could stand only a few minutes of the fair before retreating to some place quiet and safe. I loved seeing the humming bears, of course, but it was the screechers that mattered most to me and worried me more. While we were seeing fewer and fewer humming bears each fall, by the time I was nearly 11, the screechers had all but disappeared. I seemed to be one of the few people who'd noticed, and I was quite sure I was the only one who cared. Chapter 7. While I was recovering from the fire, May and Bertie gave me a notebook, along with a sharp quill pen, a bottle of mere petal ink, and several pencils. Each year after that they gave me a fresh supply. Once I was better, I always kept a notebook and a pencil with me in my waist pouch on my walks. I took notes, and before the fire I'd just point out interesting things to Pa as I noticed them, but all by myself I felt the need to keep a permanent record of what I observed. That's kind of like you on our hikes, Paulo. Mm-hmm. I guess I'd come to understand that the world could change in a heartbeat. I drew the Till owls asking their one and only question. What do you think the owl's only question was?
Woo-hoo.
Yeah,
Woo-hoo.
Good. Hoo, hoo, hoo.
It's a joke.
That is a joke.
They're like, who?
That's their one and only question.
Their name? Who's their name?
Yeah, so she drew those owls on her walk. I kept track of were-badger droppings and fresh fox dens. I sketched the buds peeking from the berry bushes. I counted the few blue willows in the hills. The more I watched and listened and stayed quiet and still, the more I understood the way of things. But mostly I learned about screechers. I discovered what lazy nest builders they were, taking over the abandoned homes of others wherever they could. I watched them eating dandygrass and green grubs. I learned they almost never made their strange screechy noise when the sun was out. And I counted. I've always had a gift for it. I like knowing the how many of things. At first it was hard to keep track, but eventually I began to know the screechers as individuals. I learned to tell the males from the females. The males had wider snouts and broader chests. I recognized kin. Soon I had my favorite screechers, and I gave them names. Kerwin had a mere stump of a tail. Budug had a missing right paw. Ansley was petite, with a stripe of white down her right side, but not her left. I got to know the families, too, with their frolicking babies and grumpy grandparents, especially since some returned year after year. Screechers seemed to work hard at keeping their broods together. Older brothers and sisters often stood look-out near dens, and parents never let their babies wander far. They had reason to be cautious. The village councillors had enacted a bounty on screechers after one ventured into a garbage pile during an autumn fair. A tourist happened upon him, and the stench was bad for business. And that was that. Screechers were a nuisance, but nothing a well-aimed arrow couldn't fix. Oh, man. They shot the screechers, huh? Yeah. 5 pieces of copper for a screecher pelt. It infuriated me. Who could blame a curious animal for nosing around the town with hope in its stomach? Season after season, year after year, I kept counting, and when I started, there were 87 screechers. I'm pretty sure, anyway. With that many, it was hard to keep them all straight. The next year, I counted 39 of them. By the autumn, I was about to turn 11. I feared we might be down to just one. Just one. Day after day, I looked, and day after day, I failed to find any more. "Where is she?" I murmured to Duzu one afternoon. He was perched on my shoulder while I peered at an empty nest. It had been occupied by a family of 4 screechers the year before. Duzu made a cooing noise. He always responded when I spoke. He had 3 distinct conversational noises. Sometimes it was a throaty purr. Sometimes it was a rising sound like a question. Sometimes it was a soft, musical sigh. I was quite sure we were having a conversation. We just had no idea what we were saying to each other. It was getting late. The sun was low, tired and flushed after a long day. The path was fir-shadowed. Here and there sunbeams cut through the limbs like golden swords. Near the top of the ridge I knelt, searching for tracks in the dirt. It was cracked and hard. There'd been no rain for ages, it seemed, and I doubted I'd see anything much. But the screechers had sharp, curved claws on each front foot, and sometimes those left marks. Nothing though I knew he'd been there yesterday. The only screecher I'd seen in 2 months, and he was a big and old with gray snout. I called him Sir Zert. He was so old, I figured he deserved a knighthood, simply for surviving. I sniffed the air. Was that smoke I smelled? Part of me was always on alert, waiting for the next fire, the next loss, especially this time of the year, when every day brought hot, dry winds. I inhaled again. No smoke, but maybe, just maybe, I smelled screecher? When they weren't frightened, screechers still had an odor about them. A good smell. At least I thought so. Wild and earthy. I moved deep into the trees and caught a glimpse of something. There he was, curled up in a pile of debur branches, his snout covered by a paw. A younger screecher would have noticed me approaching, but he probably couldn't hear or smell as well. As he used to, anyway. He limped when he walked, like May and Birdie. I suppose screechers got the rheumatism, same as people do. I took a step closer. Sir Zert opened one eye and glared. He grumbled to let me know I'd disturbed his nap. I lowered my head and looked away. After all my hours of watching, I'd learned that was how to show I wasn't a threat. He relaxed a bit, half closing his eye. I loved his eyebrow whiskers, bushy and silver white, and his lashes long and thick. Behind me, a branch snapped. I heard footsteps, movement, thwop. The arrow hit with such force that the nest seemed to explode. Chapter 8. My heart lurched. "No!" I screamed, but my voice got lost in the cries of Sir Zert and the lumbering steps of approaching hunters. "Run!" I yelled, as if the old screecher could understand me. I slipped Duzu into my coat pocket. "Hush!" I said. Sir Zert was gone, but I saw a thin trail of blood leading into the trees. Quickly I covered it with leaves. No need for the hunters to realize they'd hit their mark. Another arrow sped past, landing in the abandoned nest. A third arrow struck a tree trunk near my head. I crouched low. "Stop!" I cried. "He's gone! Just stop!" Through the branches I could make out two men carrying bows with quivers of arrows strapped to their backs. One man was short, dark-haired, and stocky. The other man was tall, with a thick gray beard and large belly. "Foolish child," Graybeard grumbled. "You just cost me a pocket full of coppers." "Lucky we didn't hit you," said his companion. I picked up the arrow near my feet. Its tip was sharp as a screecher's tail quill. The fletching reminded me of raven feathers. "Give me that, you," said Graybeard. His partner yanked on the arrow lodged in the tree trunk, but the shaft broke. "Please, they don't deserve to be killed," I said. Graybeard plugged his nose. "You smell that?" he asked. "Ain't nothing worse. And that stink?" I was so angry, I hadn't even noticed it. "They do that when they're afraid," I said. "They don't have arrows like you." "Got sharp enough tusks and barbs on them tails," said the shorter man. "No need to stink up the world, too." Graybeard held out his hand. "Let's have it, then," he said, jerking his chin at the arrow I was still clutching. My hands were trembling. I felt the tip, imagining the pain it could inflict. I'd handled many arrows, of course. My parents had taught me to hunt. I ate rabbit stew and chicken when I could, same as everyone else. But to kill something for no reason, just because? Where was the sense in that? "Hand it over, girl." I didn't look at him. I avoided meeting people's eyes. It made my insides jittery. Besides, I'd learned I didn't always like what I saw there. "Now!" he snapped. But by then I was already running down the hill, trailed by screams of rage. Ooh, she ran off with his arrow. Chapter 9. Nearly to the bottom of the hill, just out of sight of the village center, I glanced behind me. The hunters seemed to have given up. My heart shouted at me to slow down. My eyes stung. I smelled awful. And yet it reminded me of the time I'd seen the Screecher family while berry hunting with my father. That good day before everything had gone so wrong. With a grunt, I tossed the arrow as far as I could into a patch of thick bushes. "Find that!" "Ow!" said a bush. I stopped cold. A boy emerged. He held an armful of reeds and grasses in one hand and a lantern in the other. I recognized him as Connor, the boy who sold humming-bear souvenirs to the tourists each autumn. He was a bit taller than me, with warm brown skin and a smile too large for his face. He squinted, then rubbed his nose. "You've been with your friends." "My friends?" I frowned, because I didn't have any. The truth was, I'd never really had any friends. "The Screechers." "You followed me?" "Of course not. It's just, I've heard talk that you study them, and I go up that way sometimes to get materials for my puzzles." "My puzzlers?" "Puzzlers?" Connor shrugged. "Things I make. I call them that because I'm never sure how I'm going to put all the pieces together." He cocked his head. "Whose arrow was that?" I looked at my feet. I did that a lot. I know every last crease in my tired old shoes by heart. "I think they killed him. An old screecher." My voice was low. "Two hunters. For no reason." For most people, money is always reason. "I really think he might have been the last screecher. I haven't seen any other screechers in ages." I made myself look at Connor. "Have you?" He shook his head. There was nothing more to say. I took a few steps toward the village, then stopped. I needed to go back, to know for sure. I spun on my heel, and I started a slow trudge back up the hill. "You're going back?" Connor asked. "I just want to know for sure. What if he's still alive and suffering?" I'll go with you. I've got a lantern, and it'll be dark soon. I know these woods better than anyone. It was true. I knew the path by heart, knew all of perchance cobblestone by cobblestone and weed by weed. Connor set his grasses down by the side of the path. You'd have better luck tomorrow when it's light. Tomorrow? I realized with a start that I'd been turning 11 tomorrow. I'd completely forgotten. Tomorrow is my birthday, I blurted. My cheeks burned. Why had I said that out loud? I began walking faster, but Connor rushed to join me. Here, you can borrow my lantern. Happy birthday. I looked up at the ridge. The forest had changed from a collection of trees to a dark, formless mass. He was right about needing light. May and Bertie had been right, too. They'd urged me to take a lantern, but I'd refused. Stubborn as the day is long, said Bertie, who was every bit as stubborn as I was. Sometimes it's better to bend than break, said May. She was more inclined toward gentle persuasion, not that it worked on me. I didn't want Connor's lantern. It would just mean having to return it to him later, and I certainly didn't want his company. But I did want light. Right on cue, Duzu poked his head out of my pocket and cooed. "Hello there," said Connor. He held out his hand, and, to my annoyance, Duzu clambered out of my pocket, up Connor's arm, and onto his shoulder. "I love humming-bears," Connor said. "They're amazing. Is this the one that was hurt in the fire?" I nodded, surprised he'd heard about Duzu. But in perchance people seemed to know everything about everybody. Duzu cooed again. "Fine," I said to Connor. "You can come. What about your grasses and your reeds?" "They're not going anywhere." I walked as quickly as I could, eyes peeled for any sign of the hunters, with Connor and Duzu at my side. The moon was caught behind clouds, and the forest wore the night like a thick cloak. I had to admit I was glad for the yellow glow of Connor's lantern. Near the top of the ridge, I paused and angled into the trees. It wasn't hard to find him. I knew he was dead before I even got there. His eyes stared at nothing. His white snout was covered in blood. Duzu made his questioning noise, and Connor reached up to stroke him between the ears. I gathered leaves and pine needles, covering the body as best as I could. It wasn't a proper burial, but the dirt was too hard for much else. I knew the old screecher would have died soon anyway. I also knew that before long other animals, bears, maybe, or wolves, would find his body and use what they could of it. That was nature's way. We didn't talk as we headed back down, but in my head a sad refrain repeated with each footfall. He was the last, the last, the last. What do you think? Was he the last screecher, Apollo?
Probably.
Could be. You never know. Maybe she'll see another, have a family, and raise them. But what do you think? You think we're only on chapter 10 in the book, so there's a lot of chapters ahead. Are you hopeful that another screecher will be found? Me too. Well, this Connor guy seems like he'll be helpful and nice, don't you think? Yeah. Let's go on. Chapter 10. Near the bottom of the hill, Connor gathered up his materials. "I can walk you home if you'd like," he offered. No need. I sounded rude to my own ears, so I added, "Thank you for going with me, too, you know." Connor's dark eyes caught the lantern light. "Have you ever heard one call at night? A screecher, I mean?" "Plenty. Not in a long time, though." "I've always wondered what they're trying to say." "Me too. I'm starting to think we'll never know." "Well," said Connor, "good night, then." "Wait," I held out my arm. "Come on, Duzu." Duzu hesitated. Then he hopped over to my shoulder obediently. "I guess he likes you," I said, somehow feeling a bit betrayed. Connor turned right, and I headed toward the village center. The cottage was on the other side of town. Near the river, workers had erected a wooden platform for the autumn fair. The windows of the taverns glowed with flickering candlelight, but I didn't see many people inside. Already musicians, jugglers, and a handful of tourists had made their way into town. Still, things felt off. There was a quiet unease about the place. Along the riverbank, torches burned in preparation for the fair, but I saw no humming-bears. Usually by now the trees would be glimmering with a few early arrivals and fresh nests. I made my way down the river walk, the long path bordering the waterfront, trying to ignore the villagers who plugged their noses as they passed. "Take a dip in the river. You're stinking up the place," an old woman grumbled. 3 girls about my age approached. Arms were linked. I knew them from my brief visits to school, and of course I'd seen them around the village. Violet, Poppy, and Primrose. I'd nicknamed them the Flower Friends. I never saw one without the other 2 nearby, that is. "What's that smell?" Poppy asked, loud enough to be sure I heard. "That's the Screecher girl," Primrose said, as they walked past me. Normally I would have cowered, but I was mad, and anger made me louder. "It's my new perfume," I yelled to their backs. "Do you like it?" Their laughter reminded me of cawing crows. I didn't care one whit about those girls. They didn't matter. The last. Besides me, the blue windows swayed in the breeze. Their long leaves had already turned silver on one side and deep blue on the other. They were mesmerizing in their fall colors, but without the humming-bears and their shimmering nests, the trees seemed lonely and unfinished. Near the edge of the village, I took a left. The cottage was close enough to see. I couldn't bring myself to call it home, exactly. Seemed I could never use the word without thinking of my old home, my ma, my pa, my brother, our animals. The chipped teapot with the yellow flowers painted on the side. The wooden rocker where Pa sat and smoked his pipe by the fire. My sagging bed with his carving of a robin in the headboard. All gone, all gone. But a shard of Ma's teapot that I'd found in the charred remains of my home. My old home. No matter, it was over, it was done. Pain was the best packed away. Covered up, the way I'd tried to cover Sir Zert. I was good, it seemed, at burying things deep. The cottage was warm and smelled of pea soup. May was dozing by the fire. Bertie was stirring a black pot. "Well, look who's decided to grace us with her company," she said. She wrinkled her nose. "So you found one, I see. Or should I say, I smell." To my shock, I began to cry. Hard, gasping sobs, the kind I hated because it meant I'd lost control. "Willodeen," said May, getting slowly to her feet. "What's wrong, my lamb?" "They killed him," I said. "Sir Zert." I didn't have to say any more. May and Bertie surrounded me in a tight embrace and let me sob away. And though I knew they weren't really my family, and I knew the cottage wasn't really my home, it was good to be held, to listen to the fire crackle and the soup in the kettle gently simmer. Well, it seems like her adopted parents are pretty good, right? Do you remember their names?
No.
May and Bertie. Yeah, May and Bertie are her adopted parents. So we've met May and Bertie, her adopted parents. We've met her humming bear. We've met Connor.
We met her parents.
Yeah, well, except they got lost, right, in the fire. All right.
I mean, they got killed.
Yeah, killed in the fire. Yeah. Well, now we are in chapter 11. May and Bertie were impossibly old and crotchety. There wasn't any job they hadn't done during their long lives, it seemed, including working as healers, and their cottage was filled to the brim with potions and herbs, glass bottles and mortars and pestles. But their favorite work, by far, had been acting in a traveling theater troupe. A day never went by without one of them breaking into song, reciting a sonnet, or dancing a jig. It was the price I had to pay, Bertie said, for living with two former thespians. Thespians is just a fancy way of saying actors. I owed them everything, and I knew it. They'd spent many sleepless nights tending to me after the fire, and they'd welcomed me like I was kin. I did my best to show my gratitude. I weeded our garden, sold eggs from our coop, took odd jobs when I could find them, did every chore they asked of me, and then some. Still, I tried hard not to let myself care for them too much. They made it easier than it might have been. They could be surely as well as screechers. May was round and red-cheeked. Bertie was broomstick thin, taller than any woman I'd ever met, and even most men. They both had mounds of white hair, piled in flat puffs atop their heads like melting snowballs. People called them witches, whispered about them. No husbands, no children. Strange birds. It made me want to protect them, but truth be told, May and Bertie didn't seem to need protecting. They'd been together, they said, since before the dawn of time, and despite their occasional squabbles, it was clear as could be that they loved each other dearly. After a supper of hot soup and crusty bread, I did my evening chores and headed straight to bed. My room was cramped. It had been a pantry before my arrival, but it was cozy, and I had a window, and that was all I needed. That night the moon hid beyond clouds, and sleep hid from me. Duzu snored peacefully on my pillow. Everything about him was curled. He slept in a tight ball, his tail looped, wings hugging his round body. How did he sleep so soundly? After all these years, I still woke up dreaming of fires, of screams, of helplessness. Sometimes I'd be the one screaming out loud, and Bertie and May would come running in to soothe me. Duzu had been through the same fire I had. Why didn't he have bad dreams? Did animals remember things the same way we did? Or did the world just exist from moment to moment for them? I closed my eyes. I saw Sir Zert lying on the forest floor. I opened my eyes. Ceiling, clouds, quilt. Eyes closed again. I saw two men grabbing my hands and pulling me through a broken window. I heard the fire growl like a living thing. Heard myself yelling, "Pa, Ma, Toby," until my throat knotted and I lost consciousness. Eyes open. Duzu. My worn and dusty shoes. My notebooks. Wow, she has pretty vivid memories of the fire, huh? I lit my lantern, reached for a notebook, and thumbed through its pages. Sometimes that calmed me. Over time, I'd learned ways to trick myself into slumber. I glanced over the pages. It had been 2 months since I had seen any screecher but Sir Zert. I skimmered some more. It had been 11 months since I'd heard a screecher call out at night. That was almost a year ago, right after I'd turned 10. Tomorrow I would be 11. Not that I felt there was much to celebrate. I knew there would be no gifts. We hadn't the coins to spare for such things. I closed my eyes, and I tried to recall my last birthday with my family. Pa and Ma had just finished building our home. It was made of logs and mud and time, mostly. A simple dwelling, but they were proud of it. I'd even helped a bit. Or at least my parents had pretended to let me help. All the work and sweat, that building and dreaming, gone in a flash, in a frenzy of flames. What was the point in making things if they only came to ashes? All too often I'd drift off, only to wake from nightmares about the fire that had killed my family. I'd be bathed in sweat, screaming for help, gulping for air. It happened so often. I almost expected it. It wasn't so bad, really. May and Bertie always ran in to comfort me, and sometimes I even managed to fall back into an uneasy slumber. That night was different. Instead of flames and death, I dreamed I heard a screecher calling. I woke, startled, and hoping for a moment anyway. But no, the moon was still hiding, and the world was still quiet.